Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 39. Hear the word of the Lord. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. And the whole city was gathered around the door, and he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." Jesus answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, heralding the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. Word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Over the years, I've read numerous books on church growth. I've been to seminars and conferences on how to grow a church. I've studied marketing strategies and received pep talks from leaders whose churches have grown far beyond the norm. I've been through strategy training, evangelism training, visioning, and church renewal workshops. Most every one of these was some sort of Christianized version of the latest business strategies. Very, very few took a serious look at Jesus' message, and Jesus' practice. For the most part, you would think he did everything wrong. He did not structure an organization. He did not define growth strategies. He didn't even work in population centers where he could easily gather crowds. So why did the people seek him out when he did not even make that easy? Ever notice it's hard to build a following if you don't stay in one place very long? If you're always on the move, being an itinerant preacher, for example, is not a great strategy for amassing a following or building an institution or for generating power. We humans are much more attracted to monuments, constructs like temples, pyramids. We want structures that draw the eye and speak of power, that speak of wealth, that speak of influence and strength. It would seem that Jesus went about most everything he did in an upside-down, backwards, inside-out way. Then again, his objectives were not quite the same as what we project for great leaders, for churches, or for defined movements or institutions. While I was having a procedure done a while back, there was a large framed poster on the wall next to me. I was hooked up to a machine and didn't have many options for what to do with my 45 minutes I was sitting there. So I started looking at this poster of colorful images of cartoon-styled humans involved in all sorts of activities, looking for one particular entity. Where's Waldo? I found about 3 characters that could almost have been Waldo, but they were not quite Waldo. The tech that was working in the room said, well, so far nobody has found him. We assume he's there. But looking for him and trying to find one who we know how to recognize is difficult when there's so many distractions in the way. Maybe I needed new glasses, but I could not find him. Could not figure out where to look for him. In today's passage, people were seeking Jesus. He had taken refuge at Simon Peter's house. He had healed his mother-in-law. He had healed a bunch of people. He had driven out demons, unclean spirits. And then before dawn, in the very dark of night, he slipped out of town into the hills to pray. The disciples were the first to find Jesus. They seemed to have known Jesus was no longer in the village. They were looking for him outside of town where there were no crowds. The one they had begun following was not seeking to be followed and hounded by multitudes. He was not there for questions of popularity, for power. He was not concerned with those superficial things. He was looking for something much deeper. Not the concerns that would draw crowds for a spectacle, a circus. Jesus was not hiding from the disciples per se. He was careful, however, not to have people come to him for a show, for entertainment, or anything less than a commitment to a transformed life. When the disciples did locate him, they did not return together to the village. Rather, Jesus took them further away from the people he had just healed, stating that his role as herald required him to announce God's reign, not in one or another location, but throughout the countryside. The term here for herald is an interesting one. It's the same term for proclamation. It's the term for preaching. It's a term for announcing the arrival of a king or his message. It's the term for the harbinger announcing that one in charge has spoken and wants the populace to take notice. In many cases, it's about the arrival of a king, the need to make preparations to receive him. For Jesus, it is announcing the presence of God's reign, that God's reign is already within our reach. This reign is not a concept that Jesus ties to a place. It's nothing he attaches to an institution. He links it to no political reality. It's not about statehood, self-governance, party, or even religion. All of those require visible constructs, monuments, symbols, buildings, and the like. This reign of God comes about as Jesus teaches, preaches, heals, and feeds. This reign of God lives in his moving from village to village. It lives in his proclamation that people have not been sidelined, have not been forgotten. God has entered into their daily lives, into the struggles to live that they face, to reign in the very midst of their ongoing living. Jesus was not necessarily averse to meeting houses and gathering places. Passage starts off with him having spoken in the synagogue, and then he goes home with Simon Peter. Then he says he is going to go and preach in all of their synagogues throughout the countryside. As a visiting preacher, this was a place where he would be granted a hearing. He would be asked to perform the duty of the daily reading in the synagogue and comment upon it. Mark tells us that this was his norm. Synagogue was not just on Saturdays. It was a place to meet up in the morning for the day's reading and discussion prior to beginning the workday. If there were 10 men in the village, there were enough to establish a synagogue. Otherwise, they would gather at the local water source. Jesus used these social practices as a means to find people and herald to them God's reign having come. Mark is rather scant with the details. His entire gospel comprises a sermon of about 45 minutes. 45 minutes to cover 3 years of Jesus' life, ministry, and teaching. We're left to fill in the gaps. You can't quite do justice to all that Jesus did and said in less than an hour, can you? Luke will tell us about his initial appearance at the synagogue in Nazareth. It'll fill in a little more of the gaps in the story. But it's just one vignette of Jesus preaching at all the synagogues throughout the countryside. Mark is very succinct here. He just tells us that Jesus went around preaching and teaching in their synagogues. We rather assume that he healed people and cast out demons along the course of those visits. For the moment, what matters is that we understand Jesus as moving from place to place, forcing those who so desired to follow him or otherwise seek him out to have to do something. Rather than make that really easy, he carries on as if he were more concerned to speak a little to many than much more to a smaller crowd. It seems to make no sense if he were attempting to build a following, doesn't it? When the crowds begin to actually seek him out, we will be told that he did not trust the multitudes. They came out for the entertainment, for healing, for some motive other than embracing God's reign. Jesus announced God's reign. But he left the decision of embracing it up to personal responsibility. He created conditions that required others to take initiative, to seek him out with some diligence. Like these disciples who found him in the hills when the villagers were unable to locate him. Jesus required we give a little more effort and attention to seeking him out along with God's reign. Peter's mother-in-law was ill, and Jesus healed her. But she didn't just sit back and rejoice in her healing. Says he lifted her up and she was healed, and immediately she served them. The disciples left the village to find Jesus, but not as the crowd who had come for healing and a spectacle. They sought Jesus out to continue learning from him about this reign of God he was heralding. Their commitment to Jesus led them beyond the meager efforts to locate him we see among the villagers. After all, these men were committing their lives to follow Jesus wherever he led them. More than a couple decades ago, I read Rick Warren's book, Purpose-Driven Church. It was one of the in things to reflect on, especially since I was teaching a theology class at the seminary on the church. Rick was honest in commenting that he had built a building too early in the life of his church. He built when they reached 23,000 people coming for services every Sunday. He said that when they built, it capped the number of people who could belong to his church. It capped their growth because it limited their growth by who could fit in the space. And in the interim, these 23,000 people had been gathering in homes and auditoriums and wherever they could find. And it was incumbent upon them to keep up with where the service was going to be and where the small group meetings were going to be week after week. Growth came because it required more of them. Too often, we just want to make it easy, don't we? Going from place to place required more effort in their seeking after Jesus. How earnestly are we seeking after Jesus? Do we just stay in the village looking for him? Are we willing to go out into the hillside to see if we can find wherever he has perchance gone? Requires a different level of commitment, doesn't it?